Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Research Lounge, the next generation of biomedical research in Nottingham. So for those who don't know me, my name is Kate Frost, and I am the Head of Patient and Public Involvement and Engagement at Nottingham University Hospital's Research and Innovation. And tonight I will be your host or your MC, whatever you would like to call me, but I'll be helping facilitate the discussions and questions. Just a little bit, so I'm going to do a bit of an introduction to what the Research Lounge is as a concept, and then also I'm going to run through some quick practicalities for you as well. So the Research Lounge was born out of the Clinical Research Facility conference, and it's an area where we can bring together patients, carers, the public, our clinicians and researchers to have open and honest discussions about themes and topics of interest and to information share. So this is very much a safe space, and our moral is no question is a silly question, and we're really hoping for everyone to contribute, because that would be extremely valued. So thank you for that. Today we're discussing the future of biomedical research, and we've been kindly joined by Professor Ian Hall, who is the Director of the Nottingham Biomedical Research Centre, and he is going to be giving, here it is, Ian, giving us a wave. So Ian is going to be giving a presentation shortly on this topic. During the presentation, please do feel free to ask any questions in the chat. Also, at the end of the presentation, we will have a few discussion points, and we would greatly appreciate any feedback or comment you have on these points. So at that time, I will post those in the chat, so you can make those comments in the chat, or we can invite you to speak. It would be fantastic if we could have those discussions together. So practicality-wise, we are recording this session today. So if you would not like to have your camera on, please do turn that off as appropriate. You can also change your name by hovering your mouse over the top right hand corner of yourself on the screen, and then you can click on rename at the bottom of that list there. The video will be shared on our Nottingham Clinical Research YouTube channel, so it'll be available to other members who haven't been able to attend today. Also, we are going to be using closed captions for this event. If you are on a desktop, I'm just going to share quickly a quick screenshot of how you can access this. 1 second. Are people able to see that? Yeah. So to enable the live captions, if you could click on the arrow on the live transcription, which should be seen at the bottom on the panel there, you can select to see these, and they should appear as our speakers are presenting today. You can also change the font size, so you can enlarge this or make it smaller. So I'll just leave that up for 1 second. As well as this, if you are joining by a phone or a tablet, the closed captions should already automatically be appearing on your screen. To access other features of Zoom, such as chats, you do have to click on them individually, so you can't have them all on one screen at the same time. I would like to reiterate, if you're having any technical support this evening, then please don't hesitate to message me directly in the chat, because I'm here to help and support with any of those issues. And I can't profess that I am, savvy in all of the technicalities, but I will try my utmost to help you with that. Okay, let's stop sharing the screen now. There we go. Yes, so I've already mentioned that the chat option is there. Please do post any questions in the chat. We encourage this hugely, and also when we get to the discussion points, I'll make those available in the chat. So that's my little list of practicalities. Has anyone got any questions before we start with our presentation today? No? Oh, good, lovely. Well, thank you very much. And if it's okay, Ian, I will hand over to yourself. So introducing Professor Ian Hall, who is the Director of our Biomedical Research Centre. Thank you, Ian.
No, thanks, Kate. So can you all hear me okay? Someone shove a thumbs up. Yep, that's great. I'm going to try and screen share because I've got some slides. So let's see how this goes. That's what we need. Can someone tell me if they can see that?
Yeah, that's perfect, Ian. It's full screen for me. I'm getting some thumbs up. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Okay, right. So what I'm going to try and do today is to tell you a little bit about what the Biomedical Research Centre is, because I know we've got a mixed audience. Now, some of you probably will know a lot about it. I see you recognise a few names on here who will, but also some of you may not know quite so much about it. And actually, the Biomedical Research Centre has existed in Nottingham for the last 5 years, and we're in the process at the moment of bidding for further funding for a further 5 years. And one of the things I particularly was keen to do was to get views from people I wouldn't usually necessarily speak to about our plans for the future. So any input that you might like to provide will be very gratefully received. And as you'll hear later on in my presentation, the deadline for us submitting the main application is about a month away now, and so there is time for things to feed into it. So the biomedical research centres were established quite some time ago by Dame Sally Davis, and they're funded by the National Institute for Health Research. And the National Institute for Health Research is originally a branch of the Department of Health and what's now Department of Health and Social Security. And so it's funding which comes through the Department of Health to support research in the NHS. And they do that through a number of ways, but getting on for half the money which they get is disseminated out to centres through biomedical research centre funding. So in 2017, around about £850 million was allocated to 20 centres across England, because this is just England, to provide infrastructure to support clinical research. And the broad definition of clinical research, which is supported by biomedical research centres, is from late stage preclinical. So it doesn't support, for example, animal research, but it might support research using patient tissues or cell lines through to early clinical trials. So it doesn't support the very, very large clinical trials, but it supports proof of principle trials to see whether or not a new intervention might work in helping to manage a given condition, up to sort of early studies to establish the effectiveness of treatment, but not the really, really big studies. That's funded further down. And really, this is infrastructure funding to provide support to leverage additional funding from other sources such as charities or research councils or industry to support those really big studies. So, and this was set up really because it was recognized that 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, we didn't have enough support nationally in this space. And as a result, fantastic research that was happening in the universities wasn't getting through to change patient care. So why Nottingham? So I don't know if any of you recognise this, but this is what the Queen's Medical Centre looked like back in the early 1960s. I'm told it was the biggest hole in the ground in Europe at the time, and actually the largest construction site. And it became the largest teaching hospital when it was built, although there are bigger ones which have superseded it since. And there are a few things you can take away from this. The first, you can tell that air quality in Nottingham wasn't great. You can see some smoking chimneys and fires in the backgrounds. You can also see that you could get parked around the Queen's in those days, which was somewhat better than it is these days, I have to say. And so anyhow, the reason that the medical centre was originally set up, there was no medical school. Well, actually, that's not really true. There was a small medical school in Victorian times in Nottingham, but essentially there was no proper medical school before the 1960s in Nottingham. And the healthcare outcomes in Nottingham and the surrounding regions were amongst some of the worst in the country. And the idea was that if one built a teaching hospital with an associated medical school in the area, that would train a new generation of doctors, many of whom would stay local and try and drive up healthcare within the region. And to a large extent, it did manage to do that. But the initial reason for doing this was to try and improve healthcare and around training. But actually, people who came to Nottingham very quickly became interested in undertaking research as well. And so in addition to the education and training element, then a lot of research started up. And over the years, Nottingham has been involved in some really major research initiatives. For example, a lot of the colon cancer screening, which happens now nationally as a matter of sort of routine, all came out of studies that were started 20, 25 years ago, probably more than that actually, in Nottingham. And of course, the hospital has now become a major teaching hospital, which essentially has got all of the tertiary services that you'd expect, with the exception that we don't do lung transplants or heart transplants here, but we do pretty much everything else. And obviously, the Nottingham University's hospital came from the merger some time ago now of the City Hospital in Nottingham and the Queen's Medical Centre to provide a merged entity. So that's why there is a big teaching hospital and a medical school in Nottingham. But has it really addressed the challenges which it was set up to do? So I'm going to show you, these are slightly complicated slides. They're taken from screenshots from the Public Health England website, so you can all address these things. But it makes the point that despite the investments that have been made and the improvements in healthcare, Nottingham still isn't the healthiest place in the country to live. So I'm just going to show you a few examples of this. And the way that this slide is organized is it shows you life expectancy for males, for females, under 75 mortality from all causes, under 75 mortality rates from cardiovascular disease and from cancer. And actually there's a new indicator on here, which is suicide rates. And the period shown here is the latest for which data are fully available, so it's up to 2019. And these estimates are shown in a color-coded way with if you're on the bad end of the spectrum nationally compared with all the other regions in the country, you're red, and if you're good, you're on the green side. And what you can see here is that for all these indicators, Nottingham is still below the national average. So compared with the country as a whole, healthcare outcomes in Nottingham are still not as good as they could be across the whole of the country. You can also get from the Public Health England website all sorts of data, and I just picked one out more or less at random here. So I'm a respiratory physician. I work on chest diseases. And so clearly one of the things that interests me is how much chest disease there is locally, but also how it varies nationally. And so this map shows you, just as an indicator of how much chest disease there is, variations in the percentage of patients who've got chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD. And this is shown by GP registers. And if you've got more COPD in the region, you appear darker on this slide. And if you've got less, you appear lighter blue. And what you can immediately see is that London, so London's not actually white. This is the London map. You can see just to the, can you see my arrow there? I'm assuming you can, but it's just to the left of the main map if you can't. So you can see that London, all the home counties, much of central England, has got rates of COPD, which is significantly lower than the rest of the country, as measured using this indicator. Whereas other parts of the country, the southwest, bits of East Anglia, but particularly the northwest, the northeast, and the northern areas of the Midlands have all got more COPD than the national average. So we have a high healthcare burden, and we have relatively higher mortality rates in the Midlands. I have to say that overall, the Midlands isn't as bad as some parts of the country. So the northeast and the northwest have got the worst healthcare outcomes, but we're certainly not as good as some of the home counties, for example. So that tells you about how we looking at Nottingham or Nottinghamshire at a national level, but actually that hides a whole wealth of information, because within Nottingham, as we all know, there are some districts which are much better off than others. And so you can also look to see how the healthcare outcomes vary across city, and I can show you data for the county, but I've just chosen to show you data for the city. And the way this data here is shown, again, I'm looking at life expectancy at birth on this slide. It shows you the gradation, which goes from the most deprived 10% of Nottingham based on a sort of count, income and home ownership type data, to the least deprived. And what you can see is that there's a clear association between those areas which have got more deprivation and those with least deprivation within Nottingham. And this shows you, as I said, life expectancy at birth for males, and you can see the difference runs from 74 years in the most deprived areas to 82 years in the least deprived area. So that's an 8-year difference, and I could show you similar data for healthy living, and that would show an even bigger difference. So we know that Nottingham nationally is less good than the whole of the country as an average, and that we know that within Nottingham there are regions where actually healthcare outcomes aren't too bad, and others where they're actually much worse than the rest of Nottingham. So actually nationally some of the poorer outcomes that you would find across the whole country. So that's a sort of background, and you might say, what's that got to do with research? This is all to do with the provision of healthcare, etc. And I'll come on to that in a minute. So the whole idea behind research is that not only do we discover new treatments, not only do we get evidence about what treatments work best for existing treatments, but also that by participating in research, we know that healthcare outcomes for people are better. And probably the best example of this is in the cancer area, where something like 50% of people with cancer will now be entered into a clinical trial when they start treatment. And we know that if you compare that 50% with the 50% who don't enter into trials, their healthcare outcomes are better. And the same will be true for many other diseases. So in general, it's a good thing to be involved in research and to have research studies ongoing in an area, because that will help drive up healthcare outcomes. Now, clearly, there are lots of other factors which are going to do that as well. But in general, where you have good research going on, healthcare outcomes are likely to improve. And because of that, we've set up nationally some major pieces of infrastructure to support translational research. And I don't know how many of you have been to London on the train recently. I haven't been for nearly 2 years, although I shall end up going there probably next month. But as you pull into St Pancras Station, the building you will see on the right-hand side as you come in is the Francis Crick Institute, which is a really big initiative supported by some of the London universities, major charities, the Wellcome Trust, etc., and government, which houses some of the best biomedical research that happens in the country. So that's the Francis Crick Institute. Well, that's all very well and good, but the amount of contribution that makes to Nottingham is obviously going to be dependent upon rollout rather than direct interaction in the main. And so what we have to set up is a series of structures at a sort of regional level to help support research within the different regional areas. And so that's why the biomedical research centres were established. And I've put on here a list of some of the key things which I think you need to run a successful biomedical research centre. So they have to be based upon strong underpinning basic science. And that's why most of them are, well, they all are actually based around strong university hospital partnerships. And of course, we're very lucky in Nottingham to have the University of Nottingham, which has got some really good, excellent underpinning research. But we have other universities as well. So we don't just work with Nottingham, we work with Nottingham Trent, have links with Loughborough locally, and we collaborate with many other universities and centres. And within the Midlands, there are 3 biomedical research centres: there's Birmingham, Leicester and Nottingham. And together we've come together to form something called the Midlands Health Alliance, which provides a regional footprint for all of our translational research. NIHR is built very strongly on the principles of patient and public involvement. So we're very keen that we have input into our research projects and programs. And one of the reasons that we're holding this event today is to give you an opportunity to have your say on things that we ought to be doing, which perhaps we're not doing, or to reinforce some of the things that we are doing perhaps. The universities are fine, but actually without access to patients and to facilities where you can study patients, they are not going to provide everything you need for a biomedical research centre. And so what you have to do is to have excellent translational research facilities. And these are dedicated areas for both inpatients and outpatients where we can do research. Often that will be within the context of a clinical research facility. And although we're not here to talk about it today, there is a bid currently going in for additional funding for Nottingham's clinical research facility, which is housed in the Queen's Medical Centre. One of the issues which is really important is that you have to be able to access equipment for research purposes rather than just for routine clinical care. And probably the best example of that is access to scanners. Clearly, if you need urgent access to a scanner because you've got an urgent illness which needs sorting out, then that would have to take priority over research. So what we've done is we've tried to create research-only facilities funded separately so that we don't interfere with routine NHS pathways to get around that issue. If you're running clinical trials, you need all the support teams to do that, and I won't bore you with the details, but you need lots of help with regulatory support. So any clinical study needs to have ethical approval. Some of them fall under the regulators such as the Medicines and Health Regulatory Authority, the MHRA. A really key thing is access to large relevant patient populations. So historically, a lot of research has been done in centres around London, which have had the lion's share of the funding over the years from the Biomedical Research Centre competition. But actually, they service a relatively small proportion of the patient. And as you saw from the slide I showed you earlier, the healthcare outcomes in London are actually quite reasonable. So there is a bit of a drive to try and move research into areas which are relatively underserved by the infrastructure and where there's a large patient need. I think an absolutely key thing is that basic and clinical scientists have to be able to work together. There's some fantastic laboratory science goes on in Nottingham which doesn't get into clinical translation, mainly because the right connections aren't made between the right people. So our job is to bring people together and try and make those things happen. And I think geography is quite important there. So co-localizing as much as possible, as close as possible, makes sense. And of course, we're lucky that the Queen's Medical Centre sits next to the main university campus. And in order to take research forward, it's all very well to do a research study and find that drug X helps condition Y. That's fine, and you publish your paper and you go away thinking job done, but actually it isn't job done, because what really matters is whether or not that advance is rolled out into general healthcare, and that requires close links with other parts of the NHS and frequently with industry partners to get that full translation up and running. So those are the things that you need, in which we're trying to establish in Nottingham to make sure our biomedical research centres are as successful as possible. So I'm not going to give you huge amounts of detail about this, but some of you may have seen this building, which went up just across the ring road. You can see, if you look on this, the Ningbo Bridge on the right-hand side of the slide, and the Queen's Medical Centre just in the background. But this is the Biodiscovery Institute, which was formally opened by Fiona Watt, who's the head of the Medical Research Council, literally a week ago, and houses a large number of researchers, including my own research team these days, to do translational early phase biomedical research in the university. And of course, by being so close to the Queen's, that provides the ideal opportunities for us to translate things from the Biodiscovery Institute into patient care. Probably the best example in Nottingham is magnetic resonance imaging. So many of you will know that Peter Mansfield won the Nobel Prize for his early development of magnetic resonance imaging, and we've continued to create new scanners and new ways of assessing all the organs in the body, essentially. And most of this work in Nottingham is managed through the Sir Peter Mansfield Imaging Centre, but we have within the medical school a dedicated imaging facility with 3 specific research scanners, which are designed to do patient-based studies. And I'm just showing you a picture here of the vertical MR system. So one of the problems some of you may have noticed with MR systems is that you have to lie flat to go in them, particularly patients with lung disease, the sort of people I look after find it quite difficult to do that. So try to move those onto modern scanners and develop techniques to study people in open systems, such as the vertical one that we have as a research instrument in the facility here, is an obvious opportunity. And there are plans afoot to have a state-of-the-art, very high resolution imaging system as a national facility in Nottingham on the campus, although those have not been finalised just as of yet. And this just gives you an idea of the sort of things that you can do. This is some work that we did last year. I'm not going to show you in any great detail, but if you have people sat up right in a scanner and look at the way their diaphragm moves, which is what we're looking at here, it's completely different from if they're lying down flat. And so it's a little bit dark on these images, but what you're seeing here is images, cross sections through the diaphragm and the lungs, looking at the way the diaphragm moves in expiration and inspiration when people are either lying down flat or sitting up. And there's a rare condition where you have abnormal diaphragm movement called bilateral diaphragm weakness or paralysis, which produces abnormalities in diaphragm movement, which you can identify in these different positions, and you can get a feel for how much abnormality there is by imaging people in these different positions. So already we're seeing some translational benefit from having some of these novel imaging systems in Nottingham. So the current Biomedical Research Centre was established in 2017. We put a bid into the National Institute for Health Research. Before that, we didn't have a Biomedical Research Centre in Nottingham. We were awarded 23.6 million to take us through to March 2022. And at the time, that was a real win for Nottingham, because outside of what's called the Golden Triangle, which is sort of the Oxford, Cambridge, London axis, so we were second only to Manchester in the size of the award that we were given. The main partner trust was Nottingham University's hospital, but we have a theme in mental health, so that involves Nottingham Healthcare Trust as well. And really importantly, I think the Research and Innovation Department in the Nottingham University's hospital was realigned to work alongside the BRC to make sure that we were able to deliver research effectively across the organisations. And we had an ambitious set of targets to deliver. Now, because of the pandemic, we were given an extension on our existing funding, which takes us through to November next year. But after that, continued presence of the BRC depends on us being successful in a bid to receive further funding. So this was the Biomedical Research Centre that we set up in 2017. And this was a slide which came to be known as the BRC house, and it shows the 5 main thematic areas that we worked in. One of these was gastrointestinal and liver disease. One of them was hearing research, building on the MRC Institute that used to be here. One was musculoskeletal research. One was respiratory research, and one was mental health, with a very strong focus on using novel technologies to help people with mental health. And we had this cross-cutting theme in MR imaging because of our obvious strength in that space and the underpinning research in the University of Nottingham and other partners, which I mentioned earlier. And we looked from the beginning to be outward looking, working with charities, the rest of the National Institute for Health Research infrastructure, industry, patients and carers, to build added value. I'm not going to go through in detail what we achieved during that. If people are interested, I can give you some examples. But in terms of outputs, if you look at the metrics that we put into the application for refunding, we published over 2,300 research papers. We had over 380 trainees supported. We leveraged 181 million in the first 4 years in additional research funding. And I'll say a little bit about this because I think it's of interest. We turned the BRC during the pandemic to specifically support nationally important research on COVID-19 because we were asked to do that as a sort of a national priority. So just to, some of you may have seen 1 or 2 of these slides before because I showed them at a previous Research Lounge event, but I'm not going to go into it in huge detail. But I first became aware of COVID-19 in in January, actually, last year. We had close links with Ningbo No. 1 Hospital in China through Nottingham's campus there. I have a PhD student who's based there, actually. And we'd had visits, and this is a radiologist, Dr. Ryan, from Ningbo No. 1 Hospital, and Dr. Kian, who's a respiratory physician there, sent me some slides, and this is some CT scans of an individual who developed this unusual pneumonia, or at least it was unusual back in January 2019. I can now show you lots and lots of slides similar to this from patients who came through Nottingham. So that's how we first became aware of COVID-19 in Nottingham. And of course, the situation now, this is a screenshot to download today from the government's website. It tells you that in the last yesterday, 26,000 people tested positive. There were 185 deaths, 1,000 hospital admissions, and over 1 million tests conducted on the day. And we've got the vaccination figures here, which shows you that 89% of the population over 16 have now had the first dose, and 81% have had the second dose. And just as an aside, if any of you on this call haven't been vaccinated, please do go out and get vaccinated, because 95% of the people we're seeing admitted to hospital now have not been vaccinated for one reason or the other. So it's very clear that vaccination prevents hospital admission. So during the pandemic, people who've been associated with the Biomedical Research Centre have made national contributions to COVID-19 research. Many of you will have got used to seeing John Van Tam on the telly. He was being the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, been responsible for a lot of the policy planning around COVID. So he's based in Nottingham and is part of our respiratory theme. Wei Shen Lim also has a prominent role in our respiratory theme. He was outside number 10 yesterday, talking about vaccine policies in the under 18 age group. He's got a very prominent role on JCVI. I've have been much less involved than others, but have been on something called the UK COVID-19 Therapeutics Advisory Panel, and our job has been to make recommendations about drugs which should be studied in formal clinical trials. And I could go on. There are many other people who've had major positions of responsibility. And what we've done through the BRC and through R&I in NUH is we've made big contributions to national studies. So, for example, the recovery trial, which has been the biggest drug study nationally to look at treatment for COVID, as of yesterday, or I think it was last week actually, we'd recruited 713 people into that. And ISRIC, which is a big study looking at mechanisms underlying development of COVID, over 4,000 people have been recruited in Nottingham. So big contributions. And why does this matter? It's because of things like the recovery trial. We've been able to demonstrate that treatments work, and this is the New England Journal of Medicine paper showing that dexamethasone improved outcomes. So what you're looking at on this slide is the mortality from patients with COVID in those who either received usual care or those who received dexamethasone. And if you look at those people who were ill enough to require ventilation on the intensive care unit, you can see dexamethasone had a big beneficial effect, reducing mortality from over 40% to under 30%. Benefit in those who were on the ward who needed oxygen, but actually no benefit in those who didn't require oxygen therapy. And that's all fed through down to national guidelines as to how we manage COVID in hospitals. We've also been active in the area of long COVID. So many patients who've had COVID have gone on to have ongoing symptoms after the acute phase of the illness. I've said 3 to 6 months on this slide, but often for longer than that. The main ones being fatigue, breathlessness, brain fog, difficulty in concentrating, mental health issues, and others. We've done quite a lot of imaging work in Nottingham to try and understand the mechanisms under this, and we're involved in clinical trials which are just starting to see if we can find interventions which definitely help in these populations. And one of the ways we've supported some of this work looking at recovery from COVID is through a platform the BRC helped establish last summer, which is called NORCORP, or the Nottingham Recovery from COVID-19 Research Platform. And we've helped support, fund a number of studies which are actively starting to produce some really quite interesting data now. And I expect to see a lot coming out from this over the next year or so. We also contribute to large multi-center studies. I'm not quite sure why there seems to be a hyphen's dropped into this. I'm not sure where it's come from. Apologies for that. But the most important of these is the post-hospital COVID study, or FOSS-COVID, which is a multi-center study looking at the longer-term effects of COVID for those who are hospitalized, with a range of assessment at 6 months and further follow-up at later stages. And we lead the lung fibrosis strand for this project. And there are quite a few other projects tagged onto that, which we're contributing to as well. So that's a bit about what the BRC has been doing up to now, but we are in the process of applying for continued funding for a further 5 years. So the way this worked was there was a call for applications in the spring of this year. So we put in an initial application for what was called stage 1 of the competition, and we learned in the summer that we've been successful to get through that first part of it. So we're now preparing the bid for stage 2, which is due on October the 20th. And assuming we're called for interview, which I'd be hopeful we would be, those interviews will be held next spring by an international panel flown in from all over the world, with a decision next summer. And hopefully that would result in new funding commencing in November next year to give us a further 5 years of support. So I've taken this directly from the stage 1 application, which I helped coordinate. So the vision of the BRC is to facilitate a step change in research, translation, and healthcare innovation within the city and surrounding areas, with the overall long-term ambition being to improve health and wealth. The Nottingham BRC activity is underpinned by strong public and patient involvement and promotion of equality, diversity, inclusivity. So we're there for everybody, which are core values of the BRC and its partner organisations. So that, I think, is the ethos we operate under, and what our long-term ambitions are. And to deliver that, we've looked at the existing themes and we've refocused them somewhat to try and provide the platform to help us take things forward. So this is what the proposed new BRC will look like, and this is the structure that's been approved in the BRC stage 1 application. So we still have themes which map onto those we had before in gastrointestinal and liver disease, hearing disease, respiratory disease, mental health, and technology. But we also have reconfigured the musculoskeletal theme, so it now includes surgery, rehabilitation, recovery, and inflammation. And this is partly because there is a major centre due to open regionally in the near future called the National Rehabilitation Centre, which is a joint project with the military, who have got this set up to rehabilitate people from the armed forces who've been injured in overseas conflicts. But what we're doing is we're taking some of the the underpinning research and facilities that they have developed to help that specific group of patients to try and benefit broader patient populations. So that's one element that we've changed. And also the BRCs that exist around the country have got lots of medical things in there, but relatively less surgery. So we're keen to bring surgery more into the picture here. The other big change is that the magnetic resonance imaging, which was a cross-cutting theme previously, has now become a theme in its own right. This is partly because we were told we weren't going to be having cross-cutting themes in the new competition, but partly because there's lots of really good research going on, which we wanted to fund separately. So we've asked for a larger budget for the magnetic resonance imaging. The other thing which we've added in, which is new from last year, was that we lacked, I think, a structure to deal with informatics, by which I mean healthcare data, but also informatics support for basic science research. And this has just become a massive area of importance. There is the rate at which data are being generated is increasing exponentially, but our ability to use those data to inform research has not really stayed on track with that. So we need to really build that capability, and so we're investing in some facilities and some staff to really underpin the informatics element within the Biomedical Research Centre moving forwards. So I'm reaching the end of what I wanted to say, but here are some sort of key points which I think are worth considering, and I'd be very interested in any comments which other people might have in terms of what we could really do to address the issues that I've identified. So how can we build on the successes of the current BRC to give added value within the thematic areas? So it's perhaps worth flagging up that the reason that we have the themes that we do are that they're seen as national priorities by the National Institute for Health Research, but they also map onto some real strengths in the underpinning research in the university, and actually all of them map onto healthcare needs within our local population. But what I guess you might have noticed is that we don't have a theme in cancer, or we don't have a theme which really addresses heart disease. There are bits of cancer and bits of cardiovascular disease scattered in the other themes, but that's really because the underpinning strengths in the university at the moment aren't quite as strong in those areas, and so we perhaps are not quite as good as some of the other biomedical research centres in those areas. But what we're trying to do is to build up capacity in those areas such that we might include them in the future. But that's one obvious area for discussion. Something which exercises me is that we have these fantastic themes. There's great research going on within them. But the BRC award is really designed to provide added value over and above what would happen anyhow. So how can we show the added value of the BRC rather than just the individual themes? So there's some obvious wins there. We can coordinate training, we can coordinate sort of public engagement activities, and we can try and address some of these issues to do with accessing hard to reach populations, etc., to address some of the healthcare inequalities, which I mentioned earlier. And a lot of that can be done across the themes, I think. So that brings us to how can we link better with health priorities to the local population? So I've had a number of discussions with local public health about this. Some of you may know there are some joint strategic needs assessments happening in 2 areas of Nottingham. Those are Bulwell and at St Anne's, really trying to link with local communities to increase engagement with healthcare in general. And one of the things we would like to do is to try and drive up links with research as part of that exercise, which brings me to the last point on here, which is how can we engage more effectively with those hard to reach communities to raise knowledge of what we're trying to do and to increase participation in clinical research, because we think that would improve healthcare outcomes in some of those groups as well. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that was of some interest. I've tried to explain what the Biomedical Research Centre is, why it's important, I think, to the success or a successful future for Nottingham in terms of clinical research. It's made a big difference to our profile nationally, having a biomedical research centre here. And whilst many big centres have them, not all centres do have them. So I think it's really important moving forwards that we manage to keep funding for our biomedical research centre, and hopefully to grow it to do bigger and better things in the future. So I will stop at that point. So I will stop sharing, and then I'll hand back to Kate. And I'm very happy to address any points that come up in the discussion over the next few minutes.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Ian, for that really, really interesting presentation. You'll probably have noticed, if you can see me, my camera angle has changed. Had a bit of a meltdown with the technology during that presentation. And my Zoom is frozen on my laptop, so I'm now on my phone. So I hope everyone else, I've been emailing Adele, I hope everyone else was still able to see and hear Ian's presentation with the closed captions. And I believe that is the case. I don't know why my events never go smoothly. It seems that something always happens, but we will prosper.
It'll be fine, Kate, don't worry. So so I don't know if you can see the chat. So it's not so much a question, but there's a comment in there about from Stevie Van Hagen. It says that he used to park his car and wondered if it was his Mini on that picture I showed. I presume that was a picture of the big hole in the ground. So interestingly, I didn't show you them, but I did actually have 2 or 3 other figures taken at the same time with some very interesting vehicles which look completely, you look at them and you think, it took me back to my childhood, I have to say. It was very interesting to see them. They were sort of, I think at the time, designed to be state-of-the-art cars, and they were on some of the builders' design pictures which they'd put together together for the Queen's Medical Centre. So, but I don't think there was a Mini, but there was a Reliant Robin on one of them, I noticed.
I know. I particularly like the reference to being able to park at the QMC back in those days. Okay, so I can't actually see the chat. Well, I can open the chat, but there's no questions in there for me or comments. Yeah. So I would like to just open the floor. Oh, something's just popped up. So Becky Woodcock. Sorry about this.
I can read it. Sorry. I wonder if it would be helpful to define what is meant by translational research. So I think that, so I'm very happy to do that. So translational research means slightly different things to different people, but to my mind, it means taking something which happens in a basic science laboratory. So it might be, let's take a simple example. You've discovered a new drug which reduces the risk of having exacerbations or worsening of your asthma in an animal model of asthma. That's all very well and good, but does it work in humans? So translational research is taking an advance like that's happened in a laboratory and seeing whether or not it works in patients in general. And there are, unfortunately, discovery research science is littered with examples of things which look like they work fantastically in the lab, but when you try them in patients, they don't work at all, or worst case scenario, they actually make people worse. Obviously, some things do very well. And to give you some figures around that, something like 90 to 95% of all new drugs which go into early phase clinical trials don't make it into routine clinical care. And of course, we all recognize and love the ones which do make it through that pipeline, but an awful lot of them don't. And I guess to sort of to make that point, talking about the bit I was mentioning earlier about UK CTAP. So we were inundated with suggestions of drugs to try in patients with COVID. And so the reason that UK CTAP was put together was to try and filter those drugs to take forward into clinical trials, those which we thought had the best chance of success. And it was actually quite an interesting process. I received vitriolic emails from members of the public saying, you are killing people because you're not giving this drug to patients with COVID. And I'm fairly thick-skinned, so actually didn't worry me too much. But it wasn't just me; it was a national issue. It was an international issue, actually. There's an article in the LA Times about it. And interestingly, some of the drugs which we didn't recommend for testing, never mind routine clinical care, subsequently were tested elsewhere. I'm thinking of one example in Canada in the Together trial, and shown to be ineffective. And so I'm not claiming we got every decision right. I'm sure we didn't. But actually having this filtering mechanism and gaining the evidence that things actually work, as with dexamethasone, for example, is absolutely critical to improving clinical care. And that's what I think is about translation. Now, some people talk about two translational gaps. There was a review back in the about 15 years ago, called, more than that, 20 years ago now, called the review. And it identified two translational gaps. One was the early translational gap, which is the one we're focused at. The second is the late translational gap. And that's, even if we've done all this work and we demonstrate that something works, getting into routine care in the NHS is really tricky. And that's usually to cost issues. And essentially the evidence you need is slightly different. So I might have a wonderful drug which reduces your risk of getting a complication of asthma. But actually it might cost, and there are good examples of this actually, £30,000 per patient per year to put that drug into the NHS. So in an NHS which is resource constrained, the question you have to ask yourself, is the incremental benefit from that drug sufficient to warrant it being used, and if so, in which patient group within the NHS? And that creates an additional delay. And so that part of the equation I don't think has been fully addressed yet, and that's sometimes called the late or the second translational gap, which is about taking stuff which in a BRC study we've demonstrated absolutely definitely works, but actually then rolling that out to the broader NHS is another gap in that sort of process. And that whole pathway is a sort of translation from discovery science into routine clinical care. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that really good description, Ian. Thank you so much. And Becky has commented in the chat saying thank you ever so much for the really helpful description as well. Has anyone else got any questions for us? Please do feel free just to unmute and come in if you have.
So Colleen's waving at me. So
excellent. Come in, Colleen.
It's not so much a question. Hi, Ian. Thanks for a great presentation. I love the historical context. I thought that as a Nottingham girl born and bred, that was very, very interesting. Thank you.
Well, you'll know then that Nottingham used to be the city of broken hearts, didn't it? Well, so I was told when I moved here in the 80s.
Allegedly.
Allegedly.
So I'm a patient and public involvement person. I've been around for since about the 2014. I work with Adele on hearing. I also work with Andy on GI and liver, and I'm a co-applicant on a mental health 4-year study. So I've got some links with IMH as well. This for me it's going down your list really of sort of engaging effectively with the wider population. I was a member of Clark, East Midlands, which is now ARC, so that's the Applied Research Collaborative. That links in with what Ian's just mentioned for those that don't know. They're looking at the, there are ARCs all over the country, about 15 of them, something like that. And the idea being that they're the link, the conduit, trying to get research that has got to a certain stage into clinical practice or sort of move it along. I'm no longer part of that group, but this was a dilemma for us for the number of years that I was there. I think the simple answer is it's only hard work, and there's got to be an investment by research, by the NHS, to increase awareness to the public. A bit like the kind of public health stuff that we've done over the years around smoking, around wearing seatbelts, these kind of things. And just by bombarding the public with information on primetime TV, etc., to let them know about the importance of research and how the ordinary person can get involved and make a difference. And you can start with your GP practice, just being part of their patient groups that every GP practice has throughout the whole country. They're a rich source of people to engage with. The other thing I would say is I'm involved in a research project with Nottingham University and with IMH at the moment. We're looking at public health announcements for COVID and how these public health messages have been received, particularly by the hard-to-reach communities, so BAME, etc. And when I first joined that group, a lot of the participants are academics or early year researchers from the different communities. And I thought, I'm just an ordinary person off the street. I don't have any academic background. Not really sure how this is going to work. But actually, that group have been amazing because they represent their communities. Put the academic side aside, they've got such rich knowledge and information, and they're going back to their communities and feeding in. And it's really helped that project to understand the barriers and the difficulties. And so maybe we, should use some of the research community to represent their communities, because they've already got a foot in two camps. They understand where culturally their groups are coming from in communities, but also they understand research a bit, and to sort of use that group as a really untapped resource. There's a lot of hard work to do, and I bang the drum constantly and try and encourage people, because there's that big divide. I have barely any qualifications, but I had a very good career and worked my way up through that. So that's how I got my confidence, if you like. But it's about explaining to the public that they've all got such knowledge, such experience, and there really needs to be some massive communication strategy and I know Kate's involved in trying to get more people involved, but there's so much more we can do about talking to groups of people and trying to reassure them that their voice is important and really valuable. So it's a reflection. Sorry, I've rambled on.
That's all right. It's fine. Thank you. So that's great, Colleen. So thanks very much indeed. And so a lot of what you say, I completely agree with. I don't disagree with you, but there are bits which worry me in this space, and then not to say anything you said is wrong in any way. So I worry that a lot of what we do is preaching to the sort of semi-converted. It's all a bit middle class, and it's a bit sort of the sort of well-informed people who sort of engage. If I honestly say, has anybody in one of those 10% most deprived parts of Nottingham any knowledge at all about what the BRC does, I'd say that it's probably relatively unlikely. And so and it's partly, I think, it is our own fault. We are based in teaching centres, and the model is, well, come to our Zoom meeting or come to our meeting in the university or the hospital, whatever, which I think is fundamentally wrong. So I personally, moving forwards, I'm very strongly believe that we need to move out more into communities, and we've been talking a bit about how to do that. And I think using established links is the obvious way to do that. So one of the things I've done recently is join the steering group for the joint strategic needs assessment in these 2 pilot areas I mentioned earlier. But those groups have got very good links with local community groups within those environments who may not know anything about research, but who are well embedded in the communities and therefore can reach those parts of the communities that it would be difficult for us to do otherwise. So absolutely, we need to do more of what you're describing, but I actually think there's a bit more to do over and above that. And there's just some simple stuff to do as well. I look at our website and ask how much of it is in Polish or in Urdu or something, and the answer is none. So we just assume everybody's going to read it in English rather than the other two, the 2 most frequently used minority languages in Nottingham. So I think we've got quite a lot of work to do, if I'm being completely honest, in this space. And so what it is worth saying is that we've put budget into the BRC stage 2 to try and address some of these issues. And I'm sure we won't do everything that we need to do, but I think there is potential to do a lot more than we are currently doing. And Kate and I have talked a bit about some of these issues, and so we've got great examples of case studies, of impact case studies of stuff we've done over the last few years. So one of the easy wins for us is to translate some of those into some of the other locally used languages, just so that they might get a different audience, just stuff like that. Paul's got his hand up, I think.
Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you. I just want to thank Colleen for raising all of that, and I think it's fantastic suggestions, and I completely agree with both you, Ian and Colleen, and I think we've got a long way to go, but I think we need to go out to the communities, and we need to look at the ways that we've traditionally operated in research and ensure that it's accessible for all, and that just doesn't cover, I think there's been a big focus on ethnicity, but it covers a lot of other areas as well. The breadth is huge, so we've got a way to go, but it's a really, really interesting and good points, and we do have pockets of excellence, as you've mentioned, Ian, and it's about sharing that methodology and how we've done that across the Biomedical Research Centre. And I think that Becky has put in the chat as well support with translating materials, certainly 100%. I think that is a key area that we can work on collectively. So yeah, that's mine. It's really bizarre doing this on a very, very tiny screen, so I apologize if you keep seeing my hands. So Paul, your hand's raised. Would you like to come in on that?
Yeah. So I just want to ask about public involvement. Sorry, I'm a bit croaky. Hope it's not COVID, but who knows. So I want to ask about public involvement. I have the benefit of doing involvement across different sectors, not just in research, but in service delivery, in education, in the third sector with charities, in independent organisations, service user led organisations, and at system level as well, ICSs and ICPs. And I see a lot of progress in public involvement. I have to say, I see it everywhere except in research. So in my view, I think involvement in research has stalled in recent years and possibly even gone backwards. So I just want to ask, I mean, that's how it looks to me. How does it look from where you're sitting?
Oh, thanks, Paul. So I, to be honest, I don't disagree with you. I think so. It's patchy. So some areas are really good, others are less good. And I think that, so what's happened in the academic community is it's been seen as a bit of a tick box exercise, if I'm brutally honest. You can't apply for your grant unless you've got some PPI involvement. So you go to your mates who you know will give you some input and stick it on the grant, and you tick the box and say you've done it. And that clearly isn't true PPI work. And so, this comes back to what I was saying earlier. We need to engage with new communities of people who are going to provide us with help with this. And the second bit is, I think we do the E bit quite well. So the people talk about PPIE/E. So patient and public involvement, but also engagement. So I think engagement, the dissemination has improved. Certainly in my time over the last few years, I've seen that. And, we've made a big effort through the Biomedical Research Centre conferences. We haven't been able to have one for a couple of years, of course. And so everything's been thrown back by COVID. But I do think that we've gotten much better at the engagement bit and presenting research findings in a way which are more understandable to everybody rather than just to academics. But you're right. And my worry about this is that we always seem to have a small number of people who are active and involved, but engaging in getting a large number of people involved is really tricky. I mean, we've got 18 or 20 people on this call. It'd be great to have a couple of hundred on it, and so for whatever reason, our models of getting out to the people we really want to contact aren't good enough, is my view. So I don't disagree with you. I don't have an easy solution other than that we had to keep working at it, really. And I think working with the local community groups and getting out into the communities more is probably the easiest solution.
Yes, thank you, Ian, and thank you, Paul. It's a really interesting observation. I mean, I would be interested in your views on where do you think we're behind compared to other models of patient involvement in other areas? If you're happy to elaborate that, don't feel like I don't want to put you on the spot. But it'd be interesting from your perspective to see where we are behind, so we can really focus on improving that, because I don't disagree either. I do think we have got a long way to go in certain areas, and equality, diversity and inclusivity is certainly one of them. But yeah, would you like to elaborate on that?
I can have a go. I'm not kid you into thinking that I've got solutions, because I think it's quite complex. I think what I'm seeing in other sectors is a lot of curiosity about public involvement. I'm getting people asking me to come to meetings and say, can you tell us how to do involvement, or can you tell us how to do co-production? And that kind of optimism is really encouraging. I mean, sometimes it's a bit naive, actually, And I think sometimes some of the people asking you don't really know what the barriers are because they haven't hit them yet. But I think that curiosity is very encouraging. I'm seeing that lots of sectors. The certainly the system-wide stuff, the ICSs and the ICPs are dead keen on this kind of stuff at the moment, and I'm seeing that all over the place, and that's very encouraging. I think in research, I feel like it's been going on longer, but it feels to me like it kind of it got up to a certain level, and then it's kind of got blocked and knocked down a bit. I think it might be something to do with the structures of power within research. I think sometimes these hierarchies are a bit too they're a bit too elitist. I think the power is concentrated in a few people's hands, and I think wherever there's a lot of power, people don't like it challenged. So it feels to me like we've been knocked back a bit. It's sort of got to a certain level, and then it just feels like, oh, we better slap these people down a bit and put them in the place. And that's what it feels like to me. Now, I mean, I may be wrong. I don't know, but that's my impression.
No. Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate your honesty there and that feedback. So I mean, it's certainly something, and the purpose of this research lounge is to get that feedback and have these conversations, so it's very much appreciated. And within the rebid, we're really hoping to break the barriers of how we've been doing things, look at how we can improve on our involvement and engagement strategies, and equally with that, participation as well.
One of the things I was just going to add, Kate, was that so you mentioned the ICS a couple of times. I don't know if everybody knows about the integrated care systems, but they've been charged essentially with delivering a lot of the sort of healthcare work, trying to coordinate it better at a local level and at a regional level. And so we've had some very constructive discussions with the ICS, because clearly what we don't want to go in is to say, you're doing all this stuff, but actually we're going to tell you about research. We have to do it alongside the other things as well. But actually we've had a good reception in terms of trying to coordinate things better. So I don't know if the ICSs will help in the long term, but it's certainly a potential, there's potential there for them to do so, I would hope.
Yeah, 100% agree. Completely agree with that. Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to pop over to the chat. Any more questions? I think Becky had made a comment. We would still need to develop the local relationships based on trust and reciprocity at a theme level and understanding mental health intersectionally. Do you want to expand on that? Becky, would you like to come in?
Hi, yeah. Thanks, Kate.
No worries.
Sorry, I'm desperately unmuting and finding
Sorry, I did caught you off guard there. Sorry.
Yeah, just really reiterating the point about the fact that we need to go out to those communities rather than expect it to be carrying on in business as usual, and for people to come to us, and also just kind of the differences that might exist in what the most appropriate community groups to reach out for. And what I mean by intersectionality is about, these things with different people, different identities, different that people aren't defined by, or we've got somebody that we've consulted with who has lived experience around mental health, but that there are also other areas. And I know in Nottingham, for example, they're doing a lot of work around multiple disadvantage, where they might look at things around homelessness alongside mental health, or and we're also looking in terms of other kind of elements of comorbidity. So just trying to work out ways for us to have some support from the central BRC, which will be really, you know, invaluable, alongside us working at a really local level to develop those relationships and accept that they're going to take time and effort to work on.
I think you make an important point there, Becky, which is that the individual themes in general, I think, have got pretty well established PPI structures, and certainly have taken advantage of those in putting together the sort of the themes for their rebid. But it doesn't quite address the issue of this broader issue. What do you do across the whole BRC? And comorbidity is a great example. So for people, anyone in the call doesn't know what comorbidity is, we're talking about people who've got more than one long-term condition, really. It's highlighted in the latest NIHR strategy documents as being an area, but it doesn't fall into an obvious disease space. So, you know, it's much more difficult to see how you have a fully coherent PPI input into a comorbidity project than it would be to have one which was specifically, for example, in the mental health space. And so I think that's a challenge for us to sort of get that broader cross-theme representation, and I'm not sure, if I'm honest, I don't think we've done it as well as we could have done in the past, and so I think that's an area we need to work on.
100%. Yeah, thank you, Becky. Just to reiterate, I think that keeping the individual themes' identities and in their specialisms will be very important, but also having that cohesion between them all, as Ian you've just described, is going to be equally important, because I think that's something we can definitely build on from the BRC 1 into this our rebid here. So yeah, thank you for those comments. Okay, have we got any other comments or questions on the discussion points? So we've got about 20 minutes left of the allocated session time. One of the first discussion point was to build on successes of the current BRC bid, and how could we showcase the value of the BRC as a whole rather than individual themes. I think we've touched on that in those comments from Becky there, but has anyone got any other thoughts that share? Again, I don't want to put any, you can post any comments in the chat. We will be circulating a survey following this event, so you'll be able to give additional feedback afterwards about these discussion points. But if anyone else would like to add to that, then please do either wave at the camera or post in the chat. No.
I'm quite happy, Kate, for people to send in comments afterwards rather than sort of, you know, let people have a think about things. That's absolutely fine. So
yeah, which sometimes, you know, you think of things as you've left that you wanted to mention. So to reiterate and reassure people, you'll have opportunity to give feedback following this session as well. Okay, so has anyone got any further questions or comments they would like to make while we're here? Otherwise, we'll finish the session a little bit early and let everyone. Oh, Paul, you've just raised. Is that a new raised hand?
Yeah, I've just thought of another one. Yeah.
Oh, amazing! Go on, Paul.
Can I just ask Ian, during this COVID period, do you think there's anything been learnt about how to do research that will change research permanently?
Yes. I think an awful lot, actually. In fact, there are a couple of national efforts to try and coordinate the learning from this. But I mean, there are lots of things, but I'll highlight two to you. So the first is about regulation. So if you go back to December 2019, if I wanted to start a new research study, I could be looking at a minimum of 3 months to get it off the ground. The recovery trial, which has been the most successful national trial in COVID, went from design to first patient in 10 days. So what happened was that the systems all changed because they saw the urgent need to facilitate, approval processes, strip out some of the bureaucracy that's needed, existed beforehand. I really, really hope that we don't go back to where we were before. I worry that we will gradually drift back, because there's no doubt that those the length of time it takes things to get up and running slows down particularly clinical research massively. The second bit, I think that's probably non-contentious, but it has resource implications, because a lot of the work that ethics committees do, for example, is unfunded pro bono work. So, it is a challenge to think how you would manage to support that. But that's the first thing. The second thing I think is around prioritization, and that's a bit more contentious because the work I was mentioning earlier with UK CTAP, we prioritized those studies which we thought were important. What follows from that is there are a whole load of studies we didn't prioritize, which didn't get done. And because the people who were very keen on those studies were suitably aggrieved by our decisions. But I do think there's a question to be answered as to whether or not we should have national prioritization which is stronger than exists at present for work outside of COVID. And that's another question I think has been looked after. And the third thing I'd say, which is going to be more contentious, I suspect, is around data. So the reason that we were able to get very rapid outcome information about COVID is because we were able to access data, individual level data, in a secure way from patients who'd had COVID without having to go through many of the steps that existed historically, which prevented that happening. And I won't bore you with the details, but there are a whole bunch of regulations and steps you have to run through to get a hold of healthcare data. We know from many surveys that the vast majority, not everybody, but the vast majority of the population will be happy to have their healthcare records accessed for research as long as it's done in a safe way. But actually, it's extremely difficult to do that. So, for example, I wanted to know how many people from different parts of our region have volunteered to take part in research studies. And we know how many people in total do that because we collect that information through the Comprehensive Research Network. But I've been told that I'm unable to be given that information by, for example, different wards within Nottingham, even though it's not individual level data, it'd still be summary data because of GDPR issues. So my personal view is that there's a massive block around our ability to deliver research in a timely manner because of delays and difficulty in accessing healthcare data. Now, I fully accept there are all sorts of concerns about access to data, and that falls partly into security issues and partly because some people, perfectly reasonable, want to opt out from having their healthcare data accessible to researchers for other reasons. But I think those can be resolved. It's a bit like sort of donor cards. You've got to move to a system where the default position is yes, you can do this unless somebody says no, rather than you can't do this because a minority of people might think it's a bad idea. So that's a personal view. Not everybody will agree with that, I suspect. But if you want the three things which I think we will learn from COVID, which will change the landscape, those would be the three.
Thanks, Ian. Really, really interesting observations. And I think we could have we should have a separate research lounge about the use of data.
Oh yes, that's a tricky one. That people have views on that. I'm absolutely sure.
I know, I'd love that. Yeah, that will be upcoming. But thank you, Paul. Did that help address your question there?
Yeah, but yeah, very interesting. Yeah.
Interesting, yeah. And maybe another research lounge about lessons learned in research from COVID-19 as well. So yeah, thank you. Right, so has anyone else got any questions before we bring the session to a close? I'll just give one more opportunity. I have posted in the chat our inbox. So if anyone would like to raise any comments or questions when they leave the session, then please do not hesitate to contact myself and the team via the getinvolved@nuh.nhs.uk inbox. As well as that, following this session, we will be circulating the recording as well as a short survey which will include how you found today's session, but also another opportunity to give feedback on the discussion points via that survey as well, and that will be circulated to all attendees to today's session, so those who registered and who were able to attend today. So if no one else has any further questions, then I'll bring the session to a close. I just want to thank Professor Ian Horn for giving a fantastic presentation, and also for answering the questions today. And also to thank every single one of you for attending this evening. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening, and really value all of your comments, and for engaging in this discussion with us. So heartfelt thanks for joining us tonight. Keep a lookout for upcoming research lounges. This will be a regular programme. If you would like to submit any ideas, so themes for discussion, then you can do so. So you can do that by emailing the Get Involved inbox, or you can also do it through our Nottingham Hub website, which was included in your invitation to today, and I'll circulate that as well, so you'll know where to go to submit any themes you'd like us to discuss in the future. So thank you very much. Ian, is there anything else you'd like to add before we say goodbye?
No, just a huge thank you to everybody for attending, and I guess just a comment that everybody's view is equal. So, you know, just because I have a view, it isn't right or wrong. It's everybody's view is equal. That's the most important thing, I guess I'd finish on. Yeah, that's a very good point to finish on, Ian. Thank you very much. So yes, thank you very much, and I wish you all a very pleasant rest of your evening, and we hope to see you soon.